The iron gate did not open slowly. It did not creak or hesitate. It swung shut with a single deliberate clang, the sound ringing across the frozen gravel drive like a bell tolling the end of something. Elowen stood on the other side of it, her valise at her feet, the November wind pulling at her threadbare cloak. She had walked 11 miles from the coaching inn at Brathwell. Her boots were split at the sole. Her fingers, gloveless and raw, still gripped the bars. Through the iron she could see the long avenue of bare elms leading to Ashgrove Hall, the ancestral seat of the Duke of Thornfeld. The house itself was a fortress of pale stone, its windows dark in the fading afternoon light. Smoke curled from a single chimney. It looked like a place that had forgotten how to welcome anyone. The man who had closed the gate stood on the other side, adjusting his coat with the unhurried precision of someone who enjoyed the authority of refusal. His name was Corvin Drace. He was the Duke's land agent, tall and neatly made, with a narrow, clean-shaven face and eyes the color of wet slate. He smiled, but the smile did not reach those eyes. It never did. "The Duke is not receiving visitors," he said. His voice was pleasant, almost gentle, the way a hand is gentle when it closes around a bird's neck. "I am not a visitor," Elowen said. "I have a petition, a matter of property, a legal matter that requires His Grace's attention as the presiding lord of the county." Drace tilted his head, studying her. The wind snapped at her hem. A strand of dark hair escaped her braid and crossed her face. She did not brush it away. She held his gaze. "A legal matter," he repeated, letting the words hang between them. "From a woman who arrives on foot, without appointment, without introduction, and without, if I may say, the appearance of someone who possesses property at all." Behind him, 2 groundskeepers had stopped their work to watch. A kitchen boy lingered by the stable arch, his mouth slightly open. She was a spectacle, and Drace was making certain of it. "You may leave your petition at the posting office in Brathwell," he said, already turning away. "The Duke's secretary will review it in due course." "In due course," Elowen said quietly. But Drace was gone. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked back toward the great house without a backward glance. She stood at the gate for a long time after he left. The groundskeepers returned to their work. The kitchen boy disappeared. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of peat smoke and the first, bitter promise of snow. She did not cry, did not call after him. She picked up her valise, turned her back on Ashgrove Hall, and began to walk. But she did not walk toward Brathwell. She walked toward the village, where she had heard that the Duke's household was short, a scullery maid. If the front gate would not open for Elowen Crail, then the servant's entrance would open for someone else entirely. 3 weeks later, the girl known as Nell had become invisible. It was a particular skill, invisibility, and she had mastered it with the same quiet discipline she applied to everything. She spoke only when spoken to. She kept her eyes lowered, her hands busy, her opinions absent. She scrubbed the stone floors before dawn. She carried the ash buckets when the fires were drawn. She polished the copper pans in the kitchen until they held her reflection like dark mirrors, and in those reflections she sometimes caught the ghost of the woman she used to be. She looked away quickly when she did. The household of Ashgrove Hall was vast and rigidly ordered. There were 14 indoor servants, from the imperious butler, Mr. Halward, to the youngest boot boy, a child of 12 named Pip, who was terrified of everything. Above them all, unseen but omnipresent, was the Duke himself, Theron Vane, the 7th Duke of Thornfeld, and at the Duke's right hand, managing the estate's lands, farms, tenants, and accounts with ruthless efficiency, was Corvin Drace. Nell learned the geography of the house the way a mapmaker learns a coastline, by careful, patient observation. She learned which corridors were used and which were forgotten. She learned the rhythm of the Duke's days: breakfast at 7, estate business until noon, a solitary ride across the moors in the afternoon, the library until midnight. She learned that Drace kept his office locked, always, and that the key never left his waistcoat pocket. She learned one other thing, too. She learned about the eagle. The mews stood at the eastern edge of the stable yard, a low stone building with narrow barred windows. It had once housed a dozen hunting birds, peregrines and merlins and goshawks, the pride of the old duke's sporting life. Now it held only one. Her name was Soles. She was a golden eagle, enormous and ancient seeming, with plumage the color of dark amber and eyes like molten copper. She had belonged to the old duke, Theron's father, who had raised her from an eyas and trained her himself over 30 years. The bond between the old man and the bird had been legendary in the county, a thing spoken of with quiet awe. When the old duke had died a year and a half before, something in the eagle had broken. She refused the glove. She refused the hood. She mantled and screamed at anyone who approached. She had opened the head falconer's arm to the bone with a single strike of her talons, and after that, no one entered the mews without leather armor from wrist to shoulder. She was fed through a slot in the door. She was magnificent and miserable, a wild, raging monument to a grief she could not understand. The staff spoke of her, the way they spoke of storms and floods, as a force to be endured, not engaged. "She'll die in that cage," the cook had said one evening over supper, shaking her head, "and the Duke will bury her beside his father, and that will be the end of it." Nell said nothing. She listened, and she thought of her own father, and of things that grieve without understanding why. It was an accident the first time. She had been crossing the stable yard at dusk, carrying a bucket of kitchen scraps to the compost heap behind the walled garden. Her path took her past the mews. The screaming, which was almost constant during daylight hours, a raw, piercing shriek that set the horses stamping, had fallen silent. The absence of sound was so unusual that she stopped. She set down her bucket and stepped closer to the barred window. The eagle was on her perch, her great wings half spread, her head turned toward the window, toward Nell. The bird was utterly still. Her copper eyes, fierce and unblinking, were fixed on the girl's face with an intensity that was almost human. Nell did not move. She did not flinch. She stood in the cold dusk and looked back at the eagle, and something passed between them. A recognition, silent and inexplicable. Two creatures, caged by circumstance, stripped of the life they were meant to live, meeting each other's gaze through iron bars. The eagle lowered her wings slowly, folding them against her body. She settled on her perch. She made a sound Nell had never heard described in the servants' hall. Not a scream, not a cry, but a low, rolling chirrup, a sound of greeting, of acknowledgement, of peace. Nell stood at the window for a long time, the scraps forgotten, the cold forgotten. When she finally walked away, the eagle watched her go and did not scream. The next evening, she returned, and the evening after that. Within a week, the falconer noticed. The bird was quiet at dusk, every dusk. He mentioned it to the head groom, who mentioned it to Mr. Howard, who mentioned it to Drace. Within a fortnight, the whispers had spread through the entire household. The new scullery maid, the silent one, the strange one, she could calm the Duke's eagle. Some said it was a trick, a bit of food hidden in her hand. Others said it was darker than that, a charm, a hex, the old moorland magic their grandmothers warned about. None of them knew the truth, which was simpler and more dangerous than any of them imagined. And none of them noticed that one person in the household did not whisper, did not speculate, did not gossip about the strange girl and the savage bird. Corvin Drace said nothing at all. He simply watched, his slate-gray eyes following Nell's movements through the house with a new and careful attention. He watched her the way a man watches a locked door when he suspects someone has found the key. Her name was not Nell. It had never been Nell. Her name was Eloin Greel, and she was the only child of Aldrich Greel, the late gentleman of Larkspur Court. Larkspur Court was the neighboring estate visible from the upper windows of Ashgrove Hall on clear days, a graceful house of honeyed stone set among old chestnuts on the far side of the river Wind. It had been her home for the first 20 years of her life. She had learned to read in its library. She had picked wildflowers in its meadows. She had buried her mother in its churchyard when she was 9, and had stood beside her father at that grave every Sunday afterward, his hand warm and steady around hers. Her father, Aldrich, had been a man of modest title, but immense learning. A naturalist and antiquarian, he had catalogued the flora of 3 counties, corresponded with scholars across Europe, and kept a collection of rare botanical illustrations that was considered one of the finest in private hands. He was also, and this was what mattered most, a close and trusted friend of the old Duke of Thornfeld. The 2 men had spent decades walking the shared boundary of their lands, arguing about Roman roads and Saxon field systems, lending each other books, sharing port by the fire on winter evenings. When Aldrich Creel died suddenly of a fever 18 months ago, Eloan's world had collapsed, not from grief alone, though the grief was a drowning thing, but from what followed. Corvin Drace, who had served as land agent to both estates for years, had produced a set of documents, loans, he claimed, taken out by Aldrich against the value of Larkspur Court, debts so large they consumed the entire property. The documents bore her father's signature, or something close enough to pass a cursory inspection. Within 3 months, Larkspur Court had been seized, its contents auctioned, and Eloan cast out with nothing but a trunk of personal clothing and £12 in coin. She had protested. She had written letters. She had sought solicitors, but solicitors cost money she did not have, and the one man who might have spoken on her behalf, the old Duke, had died just weeks before her father. The new Duke, his son Theron, was a stranger to her, a man she had seen only at a distance, severe and unapproachable in his own grief. Drace had been thorough. He had replaced her father's solicitor with his own man. He had gathered witnesses who owed him favors. He had ensured that every door she knocked on was closed before she reached it, including, 3 weeks ago, the iron gate of Ashgrove Hall. But there was one thing Drace did not know. One thing Eloan's father had told her in the last lucid hours of his fever, his hand gripping hers with a desperate, failing strength. "The proof is safe," he had whispered. "Everything. The original deed, my private ledger, the letters. I gave them to Alistair. He keeps them in his study, the estate office. He promised me, Eloan, he promised they would be safe. Alistair, the old Duke, his study, his estate office, the very office that now belonged to Corvin Drace. The proof of her stolen life was locked inside the room, controlled by the man who had stolen it. And so a desperate, impossible plan had taken shape. Eloan Creel had vanished. Nell, a quiet orphan girl from the South Country, with forged references and a talent for being unremarkable, had appeared at the servants' entrance of Ashgrove Hall and asked, with downcast eyes and a steady voice, if there was any work to be had. There was. There always was. Scullery maids did not last long in houses this cold. Now she scrubbed the floors of the house that held the key to her future, and she waited. She watched Drace's movements, the hours he kept, the evenings he rode out to the village tavern, the mornings he arrived late. She was patient. One mistake, one flicker of recognition, and she would be thrown out again, this time with no hope of return. But patience was growing harder. Christmas was 8 weeks away, and she had heard Drace mention to Mr. Ray Hallward that he intended to burn a collection of old estate papers in the new year, documents from the previous Duke's time that were, in his words, cluttering the office and serving no purpose. No purpose. Her entire life, her father's legacy, her home, reduced to clutter to be burned in a January fire. The clock was ticking, and Eloan Creel, who had nothing left but her wits and her silence, could feel every second slipping away. The order came 3 days after the whispers began. It was not posted on a board or announced at the servants' table. It was delivered quietly, almost casually, by Mr. Halward the butler during the morning assembly in the kitchen. His voice carried the rehearsed neutrality of a man reading someone else's words. Mr. Drace has requested that no member of the household staff enter or approach the Mews building for any reason. The eagle is a valuable asset of the estate and is to be attended only by Fenton, the head falconer. Any servant found near the Mews without express permission will be dismissed without reference. He did not look at Nell when he said it. He did not need to. Every pair of eyes in the kitchen did the looking for him. Nell kept her gaze on the table, her hands folded in her lap, her face perfectly composed. She felt the weight of those looks, the curious, the scornful, the pitying. She absorbed them all, and gave nothing back. After the assembly, the cook, Mrs. Barrow, a large woman with forearms like hams, and a voice that could strip paint, pulled her aside. "You've drawn attention to yourself, girl," she said, not unkindly but without warmth. "That's a dangerous thing in this house. Drace doesn't like surprises. Keep your head down, do your work, stay away from that bird." "Yes, Mrs. Barrow," Nell said. She meant it. She had to mean it. The eagle was not why she was here. But the band stung in a way she had not expected. A small, sharp grief layered on top of the larger one she carried always. Those quiet evenings at the Mews window had been the only moments in this house where she felt like herself, not Nell the scullery maid, but Eluan, the girl who had grown up watching her father's kestrels soar above the meadows of Larkspur Court. Now even that small solace was gone. The days that followed were harder. Drace did not speak to her directly. He did not need to. His authority moved through the household like water through stone, reshaping everything it touched without visible effort. Nell's duties shifted. She was removed from the upstairs rotation and confined to the lowest, coldest work in the house. The cellar laundry, where the water froze in the buckets before noon. The root store, sorting turnips in near darkness. The ash pits behind the kitchen where the spent coals were dumped in smoking, acrid heaps. It was work designed to break the body and dull the mind. Work that kept her as far from the main house and Drace's locked office as the geography of Ashgrove would allow. She understood the strategy. She had seen it before. It was the same slow, methodical cruelty Drace had used to dismantle her life after her father's death. Not a single devastating blow, but a patient, relentless erosion. He could not dismiss her outright, not without cause, not without drawing questions. But he could make her existence so miserable that she would leave of her own choosing. The other servants followed his lead with the instinctive obedience of people who understood where power lived. They did not speak to her at meals. They did not save her a seat by the kitchen fire. When she entered a room, conversations died like candle flames in a draught. She ate alone. She worked alone. She slept in the narrowest bed in the coldest attic room, beneath a window that let in the November wind like a knife. And every evening, as the light failed, she heard Solace screaming in the Mews. The eagle's cries carried across the stable yard and up through the walls of the house raw and desolate. The bird was calling, and no one came. Nell lay in her narrow bed and pressed her hands over her ears, but she could still hear it, the sound of a creature that had known love and lost it and did not understand why the world had gone so quiet. She knew that sound. She carried it inside her own chest, but she did not go to the Mews. She did not break the rule. She had something more important to protect than her own comfort, and Corvin Drace, for all his cunning, had made one mistake. He had assumed that cruelty would make her flee. He did not understand that she had already survived worse. He did not understand that the girl, scrubbing ash in his cellar, was the same woman he had cast out of her own home with nothing, and that she had walked through 18 months of destitution and emerged not broken, but sharpened. He thought he was wearing her down. He was wrong. She was learning his routines and she was waiting. Theron Vane, the 7th Duke of Thornfeld, was not a man who noticed servants. This was not cruelty. It was, in its way, a form of blindness so common among men of his station that it passed for normalcy. The household existed to serve him, and it did so with the smooth, invisible efficiency that Mr. Howard and Drace maintained. Fires were lit before he woke. Meals appeared without summons. Corridors were clean, lamps were trimmed, and the great machinery of the house turned without ever requiring his attention. The people who made it turn were, to him, as unremarkable as the gears inside a clock. He had inherited this blindness along with the title, the estate, and the grief. His father's death had been sudden, a fall from his horse on a rain-slicked moorland track, and the weight of the dukedom had landed on Theron's shoulders before the soil on the grave had settled. He was 31 years old and felt 60. He managed the estate with a grim, unrelenting competence, burying his sorrow in ledgers and drainage plans and tenant disputes. He rode the moors alone. He dined alone. He slept badly and rose early, and told himself that duty was sufficient purpose for a life. He did not think about happiness. Happiness was Alistair's territory, his father's nature, a man who had laughed easily and loved freely and died too soon. Theron was the other kind of Vane, the granite kind, built for endurance, not joy. But something had shifted in recent weeks. A hairline fracture in the stone of his routine, and he could not identify its source. It began with the silence. The eagle had screamed every day since his father's death, a sound so constant it had become part of the house, like the wind or the ticking of the long case clock in the great hall. He had stopped hearing it months ago. Then, several weeks back, the screaming had paused. Not stopped entirely, but there were intervals, stretches of dusk where the mews fell quiet and the house seemed to hold its breath. He had noticed it the way one notices a missing tooth, by the absence, by the strange new space where something familiar used to be. He had asked Fenton about it. The falconer had shrugged and looked uncomfortable. She settles sometimes now, Your Grace, near evening. Don't know why, but the man's eyes had shifted, and Theron knew there was more. He did not press. He had too many other things demanding his attention. Then Drace had issued the order about the mews. Theron had approved it without much thought. Drace managed these things. That was what he was paid to do. But now, standing at the library window on a gray December morning, Theron found himself watching the stable yard below and wondering, for the first time, whether he had been paying attention to the right things. A girl was crossing the yard. She was small, dark-haired, dressed in the plain gray wool of the household staff. She carried 2 heavy buckets, one in each hand, moving with a careful, measured stride across the frozen cobbles. Her path took her directly past the mews. She did not slow down. She did not turn her head. She walked past the building as if it did not exist, her face set in an expression of absolute, deliberate composure. But the eagle knew she was there. Through the barred window, Theron could see the bird move to the edge of her perch. He could hear, faintly, through the glass, the low, chirruping sound that had replaced the screaming. A greeting. A plea. The girl kept walking. Her pace did not change. Her head did not turn. She rounded the corner of the kitchen block and disappeared from view, and the eagle began to scream again. Theron stood at the window, his coffee cooling in his hand. He had just witnessed something that did not make sense. A scullery maid who could silence a golden eagle by her mere proximity, and who had just walked past the bird without acknowledgement, not because she did not care, but because she had been ordered not to. He had seen it in the rigid set of her shoulders, the deliberate angle of her averted gaze. She was not indifferent. She was obedient, and the obedience was costing her something. He turned from the window and sat down at his desk. The estate papers blurred before him. He found himself thinking about the girl, the way she moved through the house, her peculiar, almost spectral quietness. He realized he had been aware of her for some time without consciously registering it. She was the one who cleaned the library grate before dawn. He had come down early several times and found the fire freshly laid, the ash swept clean, the room smelling of beeswax and cold air. Once, he had arrived just as she was finishing. She had been on her knees by the hearth, her back to him, and she had not heard him enter. He had watched her for a moment, the practiced economy of her movements, the silent precision of her work. And then she had turned, seen him, and risen so quickly that the brush clattered against the fender. Her face had gone white. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she had whispered, her eyes on the floor. "I'll be out of your way." "You are not in my way," he had said, surprised by the question, and she had curtsied, gathered her things, and vanished with the silence of smoke. It was that moment he returned to now. Not her words, which were ordinary, but her voice. The accent was wrong. It was not the broad, rolling dialect of the moorland villages. It was careful, precise, educated. It was the voice of someone who had been taught to speak, not someone who had learned it in a kitchen. He had dismissed it then. Now it lodged in his mind like a splinter. He thought of Drace's order about the muse. It was reasonable on its face, a safety measure, an asset to be protected. But Drace had seemed more animated about it than such a small matter warranted. There had been a tightness in the man's jaw when he delivered the instruction, a controlled intensity that went beyond administrative efficiency. And the girl's duties had changed. Theron did not usually track such things, but he had noticed, now that he was looking, that she was no longer in the upper house. She was not in the library at dawn. The grate was cleaned by someone else, someone less careful, someone who left ash marks on the marble surround. The girl, this Nell, had been pushed down and out, relegated to the lowest, most punishing work in the household. Why? He turned the question over in his mind. The simplest answer was discipline. Perhaps she had done something to earn Drace's displeasure. But the girl he had seen crossing the yard was not careless or insubordinate. She was controlled, contained, exacting in her movements. She did not look like a servant who had earned punishment. She looked like a woman enduring something unjust and choosing, with enormous effort, not to break. A memory surfaced. His father standing at this very window watching the estate workers below. You can tell a great deal about a person by watching them when they believe they are unobserved, Alistair had said. The honest ones move the same way whether the master is watching or not. The girl moved the same way, always. Theron had never seen her adjust her behavior for an audience. She did not perform diligence. She simply was diligent. It was embedded in her like grain in wood. He picked up his pen and tried to return to the drainage survey. The numbers would not come. Instead, he found himself writing a note to Mr. Howard. A small thing, a quiet instruction. The scullery maid Nell, restore her to the upstairs rotation. My instruction, no discussion. He set down the pen and stared at the note. He did not know why he was doing this. It was a minor household matter beneath his attention. Drace managed these things. But something in the girl's rigid walk past the muse, that deliberate refusal to look at the thing she most wanted to see, had struck a chord in him that he could not silence. He recognized it. It was the same discipline he used every day, walking past his father's empty chair, his father's unused study, his father's portrait in the great hall. It was the discipline of grief held in check by duty, and he knew its cost better than anyone. He sealed the note and rang for a footman. Lady Callista Vane arrived at Ashgrove Hall on the first Sunday of December in a carriage drawn by 4 matched greys, with 3 trunks, a lady's maid, a King Charles spaniel named Marchpane, and a reputation for saying exactly what she thought. To exactly the person who least wanted to hear it. She was the old Duke's younger sister, Theron's great-aunt, and the only living person on earth who could make him feel like a boy of 12 caught stealing apples from the rectory orchard. She was 73 years old, small and sharp-featured, with white hair pinned in an immaculate chignon, and eyes the color of a January sky, pale, clear, and absolutely merciless. You look dreadful," she announced as Theron handed her down from the carriage. "When did you last sleep a full night? And don't tell me you're fine. I've buried 2 husbands and a son. I know what fine looks like, and it does not look like you." "It is good to see you too, Aunt," Theron said. Lady Callista surveyed the house, the bare gardens, the empty stableyard. Marchpane sniffed the gravel with aristocratic disdain. The place feels like a mausoleum," she said. "Your father would be appalled. He kept this house alive, Theron. There were always people here, always laughter, always warmth. Now it looks like a house that is waiting for someone to come and board up the windows. Father had a talent for hospitality. I do not. Your father had a talent for living. That is a different thing, and it is a thing you are failing at spectacularly." She took his arm. "Now take me inside, feed me something hot, and tell me why Corvin Drace is running this estate as though he owns it." The question caught Theron off guard. "Drace manages the lands. He has done so competently for years." "Competently," Lady Callista repeated, tasting the word as though it were slightly off. "Your father tolerated Drace because the man was efficient, and because your father was too busy living to look closely at the books. But your father also kept him on a short leash. I wonder who holds that leash now." Theron did not answer. They went inside. Over tea in the drawing room, Lady Callista made her survey. She asked about the tenants, the rents, the harvest yields, the household accounts. She asked about the staff, about Halward, about the kitchen, about the grounds. She asked about the eagle. "She is unchanged," Theron said, his voice flat. "She is caged," his aunt corrected. "There is a difference between unchanged and imprisoned. Your father's bird was the freest creature on this estate. Now she sits in a stone box and screams. You hear it, I presume? Or have you learned to ignore that too?" Theron's jaw tightened. He said nothing. "And I am told," Lady Callista continued, setting down her teacup with a precise click, "that there is a girl, a servant, who can calm the bird." Theron looked at her sharply. He had been at Ashgrove less than an hour. The woman's intelligence network was astonishing. "The scullery maid?" "Nell," he said carefully. "And Drace has forbidden her from going near the bird. It is a safety measure, is it?" Lady Callista's pale eyes held his. "Or is it something else?" "I have known Corvin Drace since he was a clerk copying letters in your father's study. He is a man who does nothing without calculation. If he has singled out this girl for restriction, I assure you it is not because he fears for the eagle's welfare. What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that you look. You are the Duke of Thornfeld, Theron. This is your house, your land, your responsibility. You cannot delegate your eyes to a man whose motives you have never once questioned." Theron felt the rebuke land. It was precise and painful, because it was true. He had handed Drace the reins of the estate and looked away, grateful for one less burden to carry. "I have already intervened," he said quietly. "I restored the girl to the upstairs rotation." Lady Callista's eyebrows rose, the faintest flicker of surprise. "Did you? And what prompted that?" He paused, searching for the words. "I watched her walk past the mews. The eagle called to her. She did not turn. She obeyed the order. She chose duty over comfort, and it cost her. I could see it in the way she held herself." His aunt studied him for a long moment, her expression shifting from challenge to something gentler, something almost like hope. "Your father once told me something about that eagle," she said, her voice lower now, more private. "He said that Solace would never go to a dishonest hand. He said the bird could feel deceit the way some animals feel a coming storm. It was not a mystical claim, it was observation. 30 years of observation. The bird knew. She leaned forward. If that eagle has chosen this girl, Theron, then there is something in her worth trusting. And if Drace is working to drive her out, then there is something in her that he fears. Those two facts should concern you more than any drainage report. Theron was silent. The fire crackled in the grate. Marchpane snored softly on a cushion. "Grief is a room, Theron," his aunt said, her voice quiet now, almost tender. "Your father's death put you in that room, and you have locked the door from the inside. You think you are being strong, but you are only being still. There is a difference. Strength is looking at the world as it is, even when it is painful. Stillness is refusing to look at all." She picked up her cup again. "That girl is looking every day. In the worst conditions this house can throw at her, she is looking. She has not stopped. She has not broken. You might ask yourself what she is looking for, and whether you ought to be helping her find it." That evening, after Lady Callista had retired, Theron went to the library. He did not work. He sat in his father's old wingback chair by the fire and thought about locked doors, about leashes, about a girl walking past a screaming eagle with her face set like stone. He thought about Drace. He thought about how easily he had surrendered control, how gratefully he had let the land agent manage, decide, restrict, punish. He had told himself it was delegation. Now, in the quiet of the library with his aunt's words ringing in his ears, he wondered if it was something worse. He wondered if it was cowardice, and he made a decision. Small, quiet, but as final as the closing of a gate. He would watch, not from a distance, not through reports and second-hand accounts, but with his own eyes. He would look at his own house, his own staff, his own land agent, and he would see what he had been too numb, too grieving, too willing to look away to see, before he owed his father that much. He suspected he owed the girl something too, though he did not yet know what. The fire burned low. The house settled into its nightly silence, and somewhere in the darkness of the stable yard, the eagle sat on her perch, her copper eyes open, waiting for the dawn and the footsteps that no longer came. The opportunity came on a Thursday, 10 days before Christmas. Drace rode out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, bound for the far tenancies beyond Blackmere Ridge. A dispute over grazing rights, Mr. Jupe, Mr. Fortis, Hallward mentioned at the servants' tea, the kind of thing that required a full evening of negotiation and a late ride home. He would not return before midnight. Nell heard the words and felt her pulse quicken beneath the calm surface of her face. She lifted her teacup, took a sip, and said nothing. Around her the kitchen hummed with its usual evening noise, the clatter of pans, Mrs. Barrow's commands, the chatter of the footmen. No one looked at her. No one ever looked at her anymore. Good. She spent the early evening performing her duties with meticulous care, giving no one reason to watch her, no one reason to remember her movements. She swept the upstairs corridors. She turned down the beds. She laid the fires for the morning. She ate her supper, washed her plate, and climbed the stairs to the servants' attic at the usual hour. She sat on her bed in the dark, fully dressed beneath her blankets, and waited. The house settled around her in slow degrees, the creak of timber contracting in the cold, the distant clang of the kitchen door being bolted, the muffled footsteps of Mr. Hallward making his final round. One by one the sounds of the living house faded, replaced by the deep breathing silence of a building asleep. She waited an hour after the last sound. Then she rose. She did not light a candle. She had walked this route in her mind 100 times, pacing the distances, counting the steps, memorizing every turn and every floorboard that groaned. She moved through the darkness of the attic corridor in her stockinged feet, her boots in one hand, her other hand trailing along the wall. The servants' staircase was narrow and spiraling, its stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. She descended in absolute silence, her breathing shallow and controlled. The air grew colder as she went down, the walls damp with the chill that lived in the bones of old houses. She reached the ground floor and paused, listening. The long service corridor stretched before her, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight from a high window. She could see the baize door that separated the servants' world from the family's. Beyond it lay the Great Hall, and beyond the Great Hall, the East Passage. And at the end of the East Passage, the estate office, Drace's office, the room where her life was locked in a drawer. She crossed the service corridor and eased the baize door open. The hinges were well-oiled, silent. The great hall opened before her, a cathedral of shadows. The moon, nearly full, poured through the tall windows and turned the flagstones to silver. The portraits on the walls watched her with painted, unblinking eyes. Old dukes, old duchesses. A lineage of power stretching back centuries, indifferent to the small, desperate figure crossing their floor. She moved quickly now, her stockinged feet whispering on the stone. The East Passage was darker, narrower, lined with oak paneling that swallowed the moonlight. She counted doors. The first was the morning room, the second was the steward's pantry. The third, at the very end, was the estate office. She tried the handle. Locked. She had expected this. From her apron pocket she drew a thin iron pick, a tool her father had used for adjusting the mechanisms of his specimen cabinets. He had taught her the trick of it as a child, laughing at her furrowed concentration as she worked the tiny locks on his display cases. The memory was a blade in her chest, sharp and sweet. She pushed it down and focused. The lock was old, a simple ward mechanism. The pick found its channel, turned, and the door opened with a soft click that sounded, in the silence, like a gunshot. She slipped inside and closed the door behind her. The office smelled of Drace, of hair oil and boot polish, and the sharp metallic tang of ink. The moonlight fell in a pale rectangle across the desk, illuminating stacked ledgers, a brass inkwell, a letter opener shaped like a dagger. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their wooden fronts dark with age. She began to search. She started with the cabinets working systematically from left to right. Her fingers moved quickly through the hanging files, reading the labels by moonlight. Tenant records, crop yields, livestock inventories. She found the section marked Larkspur Court and her breath caught. The file was thin, far thinner than it should have been for an estate of that size. She pulled it out and opened it on the desk. Inside were Drace's fabricated documents, the forged loan agreements, the fraudulent debt ledgers. She recognized her father's signature, or rather the careful imitation of it. Seeing it here, in this cold, dark room, in the hand of the man who had destroyed her, she felt a wave of fury so intense, her vision blurred. She gripped the edge of the desk and forced herself to breathe. These papers proved the fraud, but they were Drace's versions. What she needed was the original, her father's own deed of ownership, the private ledger he kept in his own hand, the correspondence with the old duke that would prove Larkspur Court was never indebted. Her father had said they were here, given to Alistair, the old duke, kept safe. But where? She searched the remaining cabinets. Nothing. She checked the desk drawers, finding them locked, but her pick made quick work of them. Inside were more ledgers, a bottle of brandy, a packet of letters in a woman's handwriting, and a small leather notebook. She opened the notebook and scanned the entries. They were in Drace's hand, columns of numbers that did not correspond to any records she had seen in the Larkspur file. Separate accounts, hidden income. It was evidence of embezzlement, she realized. Not just from Larkspur, but from Ashgrove itself. Drace was skimming from the Duke's own estate. She tucked the notebook into her apron. It was not what she came for, but it was a weapon, and she was in no position to leave weapons behind. She closed the drawers, replaced the files, and made one final sweep of the room. Her eyes fell on a section of paneling behind the desk that seemed slightly different from the rest, the grain running at a subtly wrong angle. She stepped closer and pressed her fingers against it. Nothing. She pushed harder, sliding her palm along the wood. A faint click. The panel shifted inward, revealing a narrow cavity in the wall. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She reached inside and felt the smooth surface of leather. A portfolio. She drew it out with trembling hands and opened it in the moonlight. The first document was a deed. She read the words, her eyes burning. Larkspur Court and all attending lands, held in freehold by Aldrich Crail and his heirs in perpetuity. Her father's real signature, not the forgery, familiar and beloved. The bold, slightly forward-leaning hand she had watched traced letters across 1,000 pages. Beneath the deed was a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. She did not need to read them to know what they were. Her father's correspondence with the old Duke, the proof that the estate was solvent, that the debts were invented, that everything Drace had claimed was a lie. She pressed the portfolio against her chest and closed her eyes. For one moment, one trembling, incandescent moment, she allowed herself to feel it. The weight of vindication, the staggering relief of holding the truth in her hands after 18 months of darkness. Then she heard the footstep. It came from the corridor outside, a single, deliberate step, followed by another. Someone was awake. Someone was walking toward the office. Eloin's blood turned to winter. She looked wildly around the room. The door was the only exit. The window was barred. She could not hide. The room was too small. The desk too exposed. The footsteps stopped outside the door. She clutched the portfolio and backed against the wall, her mind screaming. She had seconds, no more. The handle turned. The door swung open, and a tall figure filled the frame, backlit by the faint glow of a candle held at shoulder height. The light fell across the room, across the opened panel, across the girl pressed against the wall, with a leather portfolio held against her chest like a shield. Theron Vane, the Duke of Thornfeld, stood in the doorway and looked at her. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them spoke. The candlelight wavered between them, painting their faces in gold and shadow. His expression was not angry. It was not surprised. It was the expression of a man who has been searching for the answer to a question and has just found it in the last place he expected. "So," he said quietly, "you found what you were looking for." It was not a question. It was an observation, spoken with the calm, measured precision of a man who had been watching and thinking and waiting for exactly this moment. Eloin opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to beg, but what came out was not what she intended. "They are mine," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. She held the portfolio tighter. "These documents are mine. They belong to my family. They were stolen from us, and I have come to take them back." The Duke studied her. The candle threw his shadow across the ceiling, vast and dark. His tawny brown eyes moved from her face to the portfolio, to the open panel in the wall and back to her face. "Your family," he said. "Yes, and who is your family?" The question hung in the air between them. She could hear the clock in the great hall striking one. She could hear the wind against the windows. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and wild. She could lie. She could say she was a maid who had found them by accident. She could invent a story, another mask, another name. But she was so tired of masks. She was so tired of being invisible. She looked at the Duke of Thornfeld, this severe, grieving man who had restored her to the upstairs without explanation, who had noticed the way she walked past the Eagle, who had stood in the darkness of a corridor at 1 in the morning because something about a scullery maid did not add up, and she made a choice. "My name is Eloin Crail," she said. "My father was Aldrich Crail of Larkspur Court, your father's friend, and the man who stole my home is the man you trust to run your estate." The candle flickered. The Duke's face did not change, but something moved behind his eyes, a shifting of weight, a realignment of everything he thought he knew. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss the ending of this story, please subscribe to the channel." The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not demand that she hand over the documents. He did not call for the butler or threaten her with the magistrate. He did none of the things she had imagined in her worst and most rehearsed nightmares. He set the candle on Drace's desk, pulled out the land agent's chair, and sat down. Then he looked at her, his face unreadable in the warm light, and said a single word, "Tell me." And so she did. She told him everything. She stood in a corner of Corvin Drace's office at 1 o'clock in the morning and laid her life bare before a man she barely knew, because she had no choice left, and because something in his stillness, in the grave attention of his eyes, told her that he was, at last, listening. She told him about her father, about Larkspur Court, about the collection of botanical illustrations that had been her family's legacy. She told him about the forged debts, the fabricated loans, the solicitor who had been replaced, the witnesses who had been purchased. She told him about the day Drace had come to the house with 2 constables and a writ of seizure, and told her she had 1 hour to collect her personal effects and leave. She told him about the coaching inns and the rented rooms and the months of writing letters that were never answered. She told him about her father's dying words, about the documents entrusted to the old Duke, about her long, desperate journey to Ashgrove Hall. She told him about the gate, about standing in the November cold while Corvin Drace, the man who had robbed her, closed the iron in her face and smiled. When she finished, the room was very quiet. The candle had burned down by a quarter. Her voice was raw. She had not cried. She had not allowed herself that. She stood with her shoulders straight and her chin level and waited for his judgment. Theron Vane sat motionless in the chair. His hands were flat on the desk, his fingers spread. He was staring at the open panel in the wall, the hidden cavity from which she had drawn the portfolio. His father's hiding place, his father's promise, broken by death and forgotten by time. "You came to my gate," he said at last. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You came to me for help, and my own land agent turned you away." "Yes, and then you entered my house under a false name. You scrubbed my floors and emptied my ashes and endured the cruelties of the man who destroyed you, all to reach this room." "Yes, Your Grace." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had changed in his face. The cold, aristocratic mask had cracked, and beneath it she could see something raw, something almost like shame. "My father knew yours," he said. "They were friends, close friends. I remember your father visiting when I was a boy." A tall man with spectacles who knew the name of every wildflower on the moor. Ilowen's composure, her iron, hard-won composure, faltered for the first time. "You remember him?" she whispered. "I remember him laughing, with my father in this very room. I remember thinking they seemed like brothers." He looked at the portfolio in her hands. "My father would have honored his promise. He would have protected those documents and delivered them to you. But he died, and the promise died with him. And in his place, I put the very man who had made the promise necessary." He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the stone floor. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine. "How long have you been in this house?" he asked. 7 weeks. 7 weeks. And in that time no one, not Howard, not Mrs. Barrow, not I, saw what was right in front of us. A gentleman's daughter on her knees scrubbing our floors. He turned to face her. "I watched you walk past that eagle. I saw the way you held yourself. I knew something was wrong, and I did nothing. I wrote a note. A note. The last word was laced with self-contempt. You could not have known, Your Grace. I should have looked. My aunt told me to look. The eagle told me to look. Everything in this house was telling me to look, and I chose my ledgers instead." He crossed the room and stood before her. He was close enough that she could see the amber flecks in his brown eyes, the deep lines of exhaustion around them. "Give me the portfolio," he said. Her hands tightened on the leather. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse. This was her proof, her life, her only weapon. To hand it over was to trust a man she had known for 7 weeks, a man who had allowed Drace to rule unchecked, a man who had signed the order that banned her from the only creature in this house that had shown her kindness. But she looked at his face. She saw the shame and the anger and the fierce, unfamiliar determination. She saw a man waking up slowly and painfully from a long and self-imposed sleep. She held out the portfolio. Then she reached into her apron and produced the small leather notebook. "This was in his desk," she said. "Hidden accounts. He has been stealing from you, too." He took them both. Their fingers touched. The contact was brief, but it carried a weight that had nothing to do with leather and paper. He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, not pity, not obligation, something warmer and more dangerous. "Go back to your room," he said, his voice rough. "Lock your door. Speak of this to no one. Can you do that?" "I have been doing it for 7 weeks, Your Grace." The ghost of something, not quite a smile, crossed his face. "Yes," he said, "you have." She left the office. She climbed the stairs. She locked her door. She sat on her bed in the darkness and shook, silently and completely, for a very long time. Below, in the estate office, the Duke of Thornfeld opened the portfolio and read every document by candlelight. He read the deed. He read the letters. Aldrich Creel's warm, trusting correspondence with his father. He read the private ledger, each entry in a careful scholarly hand, each figure precise and accounted for. There were no debts. There had never been any debts. Larkspur Court was solvent, prosperous, and entirely Aldrich Creel's to leave to his daughter. Then he opened the notebook Eloan had taken from Drace's drawer. He read the hidden accounts, the skimmed rents, the diverted funds, not just from Larkspur, from Ashgrove itself. For years, the candle guttered and died. Theron sat in the darkness of his land agent's office, surrounded by the evidence of a betrayal so comprehensive it took his breath away. Drace had not merely stolen from a dead man's daughter. He had stolen from the Vane family itself. He had sat at this desk in this room, under this roof, and methodically siphoned the wealth of both estates while wearing the mask of a loyal servant. Theron thought of his father, trusting, generous, too absorbed in his birds and his books to scrutinize the ledgers. He thought of himself, grieving, blind, too grateful for Drace's competence to question it. 2 dukes, father and son, played for fools by a clerk with a talent for forgery and a gift for making himself indispensable. The rage that filled him was cold and absolute. It was not the hot, impulsive fury of youth. It was the settled, implacable anger of a man who has finally seen the truth and will not rest until it is answered. He locked the office with his own key. But he took all the documents, the portfolio, the notebook, the Larkspur file, and carried them to the library. He locked them in his father's personal strongbox, the one piece of furniture in the house to which only he had the key. Then he sat down at his desk and wrote 2 letters. The first was to his solicitor in York, a man he trusted absolutely, instructing him to begin an immediate investigation into the financial affairs of Corvin Drace, including all transactions related to the estate of Larkspur Court. The second was to the county magistrate, requesting a formal audit of the Larkspur seizure and the appointment of an independent assessor. He sealed both letters and locked them in the strongbox beside the evidence. They would go out with the Morning Post. Then he made one more decision. He took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a 3rd note, this one to Mr. Hallward. It was brief. The restriction on the Muse is lifted, effective immediately. The scullery maid, Nell, is to be given unrestricted access to the Eagle. She is also to be moved from the attic to the guest quarters in the East Wing. She is under my personal protection. These instructions are not to be discussed with Mr. Drace. He underlined the last sentence twice. The morning would bring consequences. Drace would notice the changes. He would be alarmed. He would come to the Duke with questions, with protests, perhaps with more lies. Let him come. Theron would be ready. But first, there was one more thing. He left the library and walked through the sleeping house, through the great hall, out the side door, and across the frozen stable yard to the mews. The night air hit him like a wall of ice, his breath plumed white in the moonlight. He stood before the barred window and looked in at the eagle. Solace was awake, her copper eyes gleaming in the darkness. She regarded him with the same fierce, unreadable gaze she had given him since his father's death, a gaze that seemed to weigh him and find him wanting. "You knew," he said quietly. "You knew she was worth trusting. You tried to tell me." The eagle did not move. She watched him with ancient, patient eyes. "I am listening now," he said. He stood in the cold for a long time, a man and a bird and the vast, silent dark, and then he went back inside to wait for the dawn. The reply from the solicitor arrived 6 days later, on a bitter Wednesday morning with sleet driving against the windows. Theron took the letter to the library and read it standing by the fire. His solicitor, a thorough and meticulous man named Pemberton, had moved quickly. The letter was dense with detail. Corvin Drace had been employed as land agent for both Ashgrove Hall and Larkspur Court for 11 years. During that time, he had systematically diverted funds from both estates into a network of private accounts held under assumed names in banks across 3 counties. The total amount was staggering, enough to purchase a gentleman's estate outright. The seizure of Larkspur Court had been the boldest stroke. Pemberton had traced the forged loan documents to a disgraced solicitor in Newcastle who had since fled to the continent. The witnesses who had attested to Aldrich Creel's supposed debts were Drace's associates, men of no standing, who had been paid handsomely for their signatures. But it was the final paragraph that struck Theron like a physical blow. Pemberton had located a letter in the old Duke's personal correspondence, a copy kept by the family solicitor, in which Theron's father acknowledged receipt of Aldrich Creel's private papers and promised to safeguard them. The letter was dated 3 weeks before the old Duke's death. He had known. He had accepted the trust, and he had hidden the documents in the very office that Drace would later claim as his own. It was, Pemberton wrote, a tragedy of timing. Had the old Duke lived another month, he would almost certainly have placed the papers in more secure hands. Instead, they had remained hidden, while the man they were meant to protect against took possession of the room that concealed them. Theron folded the letter carefully. He placed it in the strongbox with the other documents. The weight of his family's failure pressed down on him like stone. His father had tried to do the right thing and died too soon. He himself had inherited the responsibility and been too consumed by grief to even know it existed. And all the while a young woman had lost everything, her home, her name, her place in the world, because 2 dukes, father and son, had failed in their duty of care. Christmas was 4 days away. He knew what had to be done, and he knew it had to be done properly, not behind closed doors, not with quiet settlements and discreet arrangements. The truth had been buried for too long. It would be spoken aloud, in the light, before witnesses. He rang for Mr. Howard and gave instructions for Christmas Eve. On the morning of December the 23rd, Theron summoned Lady Callista to the library. She came in her morning dress, Marchpane trotting at her heels, and found her nephew standing behind his desk with the strongbox open before him. His face was drawn but resolute, the face of a man who has passed through doubt and come out the other side with certainty. "Sit down, Aunt," he said. She sat, her sharp eyes taking in the documents spread across the desk, the portfolio, the notebook, the letters, the deed. She said nothing. She waited. He told her everything. He told her about the night in the office, about Alohan's confession, about the forged debts, about Drace's embezzlement from both estates. He told her about his father's letter, the promise made and broken by death. He told her about Pemberton's investigation and the magistrate's audit. He told her about the girl who had scrubbed his floors for 7 weeks while the proof of her stolen life lay hidden behind a wooden panel 10 feet from where its thief sat every day. Lady Callista listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she reached across the desk and picked up the deed to Larkspur Court. She held it as if it were a living thing, something fragile and precious. "Aldrich Crail," she said softly. "I remember him. He brought your father a hawk orchid once, dug from the meadow at Larkspur. Your father kept it in the glasshouse for years. He said it was the most thoughtful gift anyone had ever given him." She set the deed down. "And his daughter, the girl in the kitchen." "She is no more a scullery maid than you are, Aunt. No," Lady Callista said, her voice thick. "She is not. She is Aldrich's child, and she has her father's spine." She looked at him. "What do you intend?" "I intend to set it right publicly, on Christmas Eve, before the entire household." His aunt studied him, and for the first time in his memory, he saw tears in her pale, fierce eyes. "Your father would be proud of you," she said. "He would be desperately ashamed of the failure, as you are, but he would be proud of the man who is correcting it." Theron's jaw tightened. He did not trust himself to speak. "And the girl," Lady Callista added, watching him closely. "What do you intend for her?" "I intend to restore what was taken from her, Larkspur Court. Her name, her standing, and nothing more." He met her gaze. Something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. "That," he said quietly, "will be her choice, not mine." Lady Callista nodded slowly. She rose from her chair and kissed him on the forehead, a gesture so unexpected and so tender that he had to close his eyes against the force of it. "Then let us prepare," she said. "We have a great deal of wrong to make right, and very little time." Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in silence. The snow had come overnight, not the wild driving kind, but a deep and steady fall that blanketed the moors and muffled the world to a whisper. Ashgrove Hall stood in its white landscape like a painting, smoke rising straight and pale from its chimneys into a sky the color of pewter. Inside, the household had gathered, not for celebration. Hallward had conveyed the Duke's instruction that morning with his usual impassive formality. All staff were to assemble in the great hall at 4 o'clock. Attendance was not optional. No reason was given. The servants arrived in their best uniforms, uneasy and curious. Mrs. Barrow stood with the kitchen staff, her broad face wary. Fenton the falconer lingered near the back, his cap in his hands. The footmen arranged themselves along the wall. Mr. Hallward stood by the door, his expression giving nothing away. Elowen was among them. She had been moved to the East Wing 3 days ago, a change that had sent a shockwave through the household. She was no longer dressed as a scullery maid. Lady Callista had seen to that, arriving at her door with a simple but well-made gown of deep blue wool, the kind a respectable young woman of gentle birth would wear. "You will not face this in an apron," Lady Callista had said, her tone brooking no argument. "You will face this as yourself." Now Elowen stood at the edge of the gathered staff, her hands clasped, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her temples. She did not know exactly what the Duke had planned. He had not spoken to her since the night in the office. She had seen him only at a distance, a tall figure moving through the house with a new, purposeful energy that was markedly different from the weary, mechanical routine of the weeks before. She knew only that something was about to change, and that the changing would be irreversible. The doors to the great hall opened, and the Duke entered. He was dressed formally, in a dark coat and white cravat, his bearing severe and commanding. Lady Callista walked beside him, her hand on his arm, her face calm and composed. Behind them, flanked by 2 men, Elowen did not recognize, men in professional dark suits who carried leather cases, walked Corvin Drace. The land agent's face was ashen. He had been summoned to the Duke's study an hour earlier and presented with the contents of the strongbox. He had been given the choice to come willingly or to be brought. He had come willingly, but the willingness had cost him. His movements were stiff, his eyes darting. The smooth confidence of the man who had closed the gate in Eloan's face stripped away like varnish in a fire. The Duke took his position at the head of the hall, before the great stone fireplace where a massive Yule log burned. He surveyed the assembled household. His gaze swept the room and came to rest briefly on Eloan. Something softened in his eyes, a warmth that was there and gone in an instant, visible only to someone who was looking for it. She was looking. "Thank you for assembling," he said. His voice was clear and carried easily in the vaulted space. "I have asked you here because a wrong has been done in this house, a wrong that has persisted for too long, and it is my duty as your master and as the Duke of Thornfeld to correct it." He paused. The silence was total. Even Marchpane, tucked under Lady Callista's arm, was still. "For 11 years, Mr. Corvin Drace has served as land agent of this estate. He was trusted by my father and he was trusted by me. That trust was misplaced." A ripple went through the assembled staff. Eyes turned to Drace. The land agent stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Mr. Drace has systematically embezzled funds from this estate over the course of his employment. He has falsified accounts, diverted rents, and enriched himself at the expense of this household and its tenants. The evidence is comprehensive, and has been verified by my solicitor and an independent assessor." He let the words settle. "Mrs. Kell." Barrow's hand went to her mouth. Mr. Howard's face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "But his crimes against Ashgrove," the Duke continued, his voice dropping to a quieter, harder register, "are not the worst of what he has done." He turned to the men in dark suits. One of them opened his case and produced a sheaf of documents. The Duke took them and held them up. 18 months ago, when the gentleman Aldrich Crail of Larkspur Court died, Mr. Brex. Drace produced forged documents claiming the estate was crippled by debt. He seized Larkspur Court through fraud. He sold its contents, and he cast out its rightful owner, Aldrich's only daughter, with nothing. He set the documents on the mantelpiece and looked directly at Eloan. "That daughter is standing in this room. Every head turned, every eye found her." Eloan felt the weight of all those gazes land on her at once, and she did not look away. She stood in her blue dress with her hands at her sides and her chin level and met the Duke's eyes across the hall. "Her name," the Duke said, and his voice carried the weight of a man correcting an unforgivable error, "is not Nell. Her name is Eloan Greel. She is the rightful lady of Larkspur Court. She came to my gate 7 weeks ago to petition me for help, and my own land agent, the man who had robbed her, turned her away. She entered this house as a servant because it was the only door left open to her. She worked in our kitchens and slept in our coldest room and bore indignities that should never have been permitted, all to find a proof of what was stolen from her." He picked up the portfolio from the mantelpiece. "This is the deed to Larkspur Court, left in my father's safekeeping by Aldrich Creel. My father hid it in this house to protect it. He died before he could fulfill his promise. I failed to fulfill it after him. That failure ends today." He crossed the hall. The staff parted before him. He walked to Eloan and stopped in front of her. The firelight played across both their faces. She could see the emotion in his eyes, the shame and the resolve, and something else, something luminous and unguarded that he was not trying to hide. He held out the portfolio. "Miss Crail," he said, "this belongs to you. It always did." Her hands were shaking as she took it. The leather was warm from his grip. She opened it and saw her father's handwriting, his signature, his deed. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks, quiet tears, unstoppable, the release of 18 months of silence and endurance and solitary, grinding hope. "Thank you," she whispered. It was inadequate. There were no words adequate for this. He inclined his head. Then he turned back to Drace. The land agent had not moved. He stood in the center of the hall, stripped of everything: his position, his authority, his carefully constructed respectability. The two men beside him were representatives of the magistrate. They waited, impassive. "Mr. Drace," the Duke said, "you will be escorted from this estate. Your accounts have been frozen. The magistrate will determine the legal consequences of your actions. You will not return to this house. You will not contact Miss Crail. You will not set foot on the lands of either Ashgrove or Larkspur." Again Drace finally looked up. His face was a ruin. The smooth, pleasant mask was gone, and beneath it was something small and cornered and desperate. "Your Grace," he began, his voice cracking, "I served your father for—" "You robbed my father," Theron said, his voice soft and final. "You robbed this estate, and you robbed a grieving woman of her home and her name, and forced her to scrub your floors while you sat in an office built on her ruin. Do not speak to me of service." Drace's mouth closed. Something collapsed behind his eyes. The magistrate's men stepped forward. Without ceremony, without drama, they led Corvin Drace out of the great hall of Ashgrove, through the entrance and into the waiting carriage. The door closed. The wheels crunched on the snow, and then he was gone. The hall was silent. Eloan stood with the portfolio pressed against her chest, tears still falling, surrounded by a household of people who had ignored her, dismissed her, and looked through her for 7 weeks, and who were now seeing her for the first time. Lady Callista stepped forward and took Eloan's hand. "Welcome back, my dear," she said, her voice clear and warm enough to fill the vast, cold room. "Welcome home." Christmas morning came to Ashgrove Hall for the first time in over a year, with something that felt, tentatively and cautiously, like joy. The snow had stopped overnight, and the world outside was a vast, clean page, white fields stretching to the horizon under a sky of pale, luminous blue. Smoke rose from the chimneys. The Yule log still burned in the great hall. Someone, Mrs. Barrow probably, had hung greenery along the banisters, holly and ivy and sprigs of mistletoe, and the house smelled of pine and cinnamon and fresh bread. Eloan woke in the east wing, in a bed with clean linen sheets and a down quilt, in a room with a fire that someone else had lit. For a long, disoriented moment, she did not know where she was. Then she saw the portfolio on the nightstand, and she remembered, and the remembering was like stepping from a dark room into sunlight. She dressed in the blue gown Lady Callista had given her, and went downstairs. The household was transformed. The pall that had hung over Ashgrove since the old Duke's death had lifted, not entirely, not all at once, but perceptibly, like the first day of a thaw. The servant's manner toward her had shifted. There was no more avoidance, no more whispered gossip. There was something closer to respect, earned the hardest possible way. Mrs. Barrow found her in the corridor and pressed a cup of hot chocolate into her hands. "I should have been kinder," the cook said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. "I knew something wasn't right about how Drace treated you. I should have said something." "You did not know," Eloan said gently. "I knew enough to be ashamed of myself. Merry Christmas, Miss Creel." It was the first time anyone in the household had used her real name, and the sound of it, spoken aloud, spoken naturally, made her chest ache with a sweetness that was almost unbearable. She found Theron in the library. He was standing by the window, looking out at the white landscape. He was dressed simply, no formal coat, no cravat. He looked younger in the morning light, the sharp lines of his face softened by something she had not seen there before: rest. He had slept. He turned when she entered, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. The air between them was charged with everything that had happened, and everything that had not yet been said. "Merry Christmas, Miss Grail," he said. "Merry Christmas, Your Grace. I think," he said with the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, "that, given the circumstances, you might call me Theron. Then you must call me Eloan." He nodded. The almost smile widened by a fraction. "Eloan," he said, as if testing the weight of it. "It suits you far better than Nell." She laughed. It surprised them both. It was a small sound, quiet and slightly rusty from disuse, but it was real, and it changed the temperature of the room the way a struck match changes a dark one. "I have something to show you," he said. He led her out of the library, through the great hall and out the side door into the stable yard. The cold hit her skin like a blessing, clean and sharp and alive. The snow crunched under their boots, their breath plumed in the still air. They walked to the mews. Fenton was there, the falconer, standing by the open door with a heavy leather gauntlet on his arm and an expression of barely contained wonder on his weathered face. "She's ready, Your Grace," he said. Theron looked at Eloan. "My aunt tells me your father kept birds' kestrels," Eloan said. "When I was young, he taught me to fly them in the meadow at Larkspur. Then you know what to do." He took the gauntlet from Fenton and held it out to her. "She has been caged long enough." Eloan pulled on the gauntlet. It was too large for her hand, heavy and stiff with age. She stepped into the mews. Solus was on her perch. The great golden eagle turned her head and fixed Eloan with those burning copper eyes. The bird was still, her feathers smooth, her posture alert but calm. She had not screamed in days. Eloan raised her arm. She did not call. She did not whistle. She simply stood and waited, her gloved fist extended, her gaze steady. The eagle studied her for a long moment. Then, with a single powerful beat of her wings, she launched from the perch and landed on Eloan's fist. The weight was enormous, a warm, living anchor, the talons gripping the leather with a controlled, deliberate strength. Soleil settled her feathers and looked at Eloan, and the low chirruping sound, the sound that had begun everything, filled the quiet morning air. Eloan walked out of the mews and into the snow-covered yard. The eagle sat on her arm, magnificent against the white landscape, her plumage blazing amber in the winter sun. Theron was watching. Lady Callista had appeared at the stable door, Marchpane tucked under one arm, her pale eyes bright with tears. She would never admit to. Eloan looked at the sky. It was vast and open and impossibly blue. She looked at the eagle. She looked at the man standing in the snow, the serious, grieving, awakening man who had found her in the dark and chosen to bring her into the light. She raised her arm and opened her hand. The eagle launched. The force of it staggered her, the great wings beating the air into thunder, and then Solus was rising, climbing, soaring above the rooftops of Ashgrove, above the bare elms, above the white fields, a dark golden shape against the blue, circling higher and higher in the still December air. Free. They watched her fly. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind and the distant cry of the eagle. Not a scream this time, but a call, wild and exultant, the sound of a creature restored to its own nature. Theron came to stand beside Eloan. Their shoulders almost touched. The eagle wheeled above them, drawing great spirals in the sky. "Pemberton confirms that Larkspur Court will be fully restored to your name by the new year," he said. "The fraudulent debts have been annulled. The property is yours. Your father's collection is being traced and recovered. You will have your home back. Eloan, all of it." She watched the eagle and felt the tears come again, but different tears this time, warm and quiet and full of something she had almost forgotten existed: gratitude. Not just for the house or the deed or the vindication, but for being seen, for being believed, for being called by her name. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. "You do not need to thank me. I corrected an injustice that should never have been allowed to occur. It is I who owe you the debt. Then we are even," she said, "and we can begin again." He turned to look at her. The morning light was on his face, and for the first time she saw him. Without the armor, without the granite, without the careful distance he maintained from the world, she saw the man beneath, and he was not cold at all. He was warm and uncertain and hopeful and afraid, and all the things that people are when they are standing at the beginning of something they cannot yet name. I am not a man who rushes, he said. His voice was low, almost hesitant, so different from the commanding authority of the great hall. I am slow and methodical, and I have been told by my aunt, on numerous occasions, that I have all the romantic instincts of a surveyor's theodolite. Eloin laughed again, that small, surprised sound. Your aunt is a remarkable woman. She is a menace, but she is occasionally correct. He paused. The eagle cried above them, I will not ask you for anything today. You have your home, your name, your freedom. You owe me nothing, and I would not have you feel obligated. But I would ask, if it is not unwelcome, for the chance to call on you at Larkspur, when you are settled, not as a duke visiting a neighbor, but as a man who would very much like to know Eloin Greel. The real Eloin, not the girl in the gray dress, the woman who walked through the fire and came out unbroken. She was quiet for a moment. The eagle was descending now, spiraling down in lazy, graceful circles, dropping toward the stable yard. You may call on me, she said. On one condition. Name it. Bring the eagle. He smiled. It was the first true, full, unguarded smile she had ever seen on his face, and it transformed him. The severity fell away. The grief, still present, but no longer sovereign, softened to something bearable. He looked, for one shining moment, like a man who had remembered what it felt like to be happy. Sala swept down and landed on the gatepost of the stable yard, her talons gripping the snow-dusted wood. She folded her wings and regarded them both with her ancient, knowing gaze. The Duke and the Lady of Larkspur Court stood together in the Christmas snow, not touching, not yet, but close, closer than they had ever been, with the eagle between them and the wide, white, open world ahead. Above the moors, the church bells in Brathwell began to ring, carrying across the snow-hushed valley, calling the faithful to Christmas morning. The sound reached Ashgrove and Larkspur alike. Two estates, two houses, separated by a river and joined now by something stronger than property or title, or the iron gates that had once stood between them. It was the sound of a beginning.